News of the day.
Mr. Zimmerman, have you made a decision as to whether or not you want to testify in this case?
With values that never die.
There are certainly a lot of controversies or scandals brewing right now when it comes to the Obama administration.
This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
Dealing with the federal government is not always high-tech, and it's not always user-friendly.
The stories that matter.
This is a massive escalation in the tension here in Egypt.
The issues that count.
I don't know why the media tries to make this into a sensation. We have never hidden the fact that we supply Syria with weapons.
This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
He's got the red, white, blue flying high on the farm. Semper Fi tattooed on his left arm.
Welcome to American Heartland with Dr. Grace. I'm the editor of Politics and Culture at worldtribune.com. Thank you for joining us on this broadcast. And just to remind everybody, if you happen to miss a show, every single episode is on YouTube. Well, it looks like the President of the United States suddenly woke up and realized, hey, we're at war. He has been trying to tell us that by simply withdrawing troops from Iraq, the war on terror was coming to an end. Because he wanted it to be so, because he imagined it to be so. And he woke up to a couple of beheadings of American journalists and suddenly realized, oh my, just because I want something in my mind doesn't mean it's actually so. See, this is a process of evolving. This is a process of going from adolescence to adulthood. You suddenly realize that the world just isn't the way you want it to be. So President Obama woke up after his long vacation, after a couple beheadings, and felt that at last, it's time to acknowledge to the American people that we are at war, let alone that the terrorists have not stopped being at war with us since 9/11, preceding that, and since then, and following the withdrawal of troops from Iraq. They never stopped being at war. But in his mind, because he wanted the war to end there, he thought it would end. And like a fool, ignoring every expert's counsel, he pulled away all of our troops there, leaving the field wide open to a terrorist enemy far worse than Al-Qaeda. So finally, this week, compelled, led by an outraged public opinion, dragged, kicking and screaming by an outraged public opinion, he had to reverse himself. And reverse not just the last couple of months, but reverse everything he has been saying since the time that he was vying for office, since 2008. He had to do a complete about-face. And many commentators have said, if this was a parliamentary system, at this point, we would be able to throw him out of office purely on a no-confidence vote. You cannot say one thing for years and years and years and then go to the American public and tell them that everything you said isn't quite accurate and still remain in office. That generally just does not happen in a parliamentary system. And what you're seeing now is Democrats do not know what to do. If they abandon this president now, they're going to have to take some responsibility for the years that have passed. And yet, if they stick with him, it means that they too have to do a complete about-face of everything that they've said. So the cracks and fissures within the Democratic Party are going to be something fascinating to watch over the course of the next couple of months. But what is absolutely astonishing, interesting, and riveting right now is what are we going to do when a president who is leading a foreign policy has gotten it all wrong and is now trying to fix his errors. He is trying to turn the tide. The public no longer trusts that he can lead us in international affairs. And this week he delivered a speech declaring that we are going to destroy and eradicate ISIS. He finally has a plan. He finally has a strategy. This strategy has 4 parts, and this strategy is going to be a long-term strategy. Right before our eyes, he went from the peacenik president to the president of war. And when listening to the speech last night with my husband, I turned to him and I said, you know, if I were a Democrat, all I would be thinking right now is we are now Republican light. Many Republicans, we always chastise ourselves when we see turncoats in our party and we say, oh, that's just Democrat light. And we don't want to be Democrat light. But right now, Obama is Republican light because he has to do everything that Bush and Cheney were doing. But he has to do it without wanting to do it, without being fully committed to doing it. And that's why he is Republican light. The Democrats are really uncomfortable with it, and the American people are really uncomfortable with this. Now let's untangle this mess and how the president wants to get us out of it. The 4-part strategy. Part number 1. Roll it, Brittany.
We will degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL through a comprehensive and sustained counterterrorism strategy. First, we will conduct a systematic campaign of airstrikes against these terrorists. Working with the Iraqi government, we will expand our efforts beyond protecting our own people and humanitarian missions so that we're hitting ISIL targets as Iraqi forces go on offense. Moreover, I've made it clear that we will hunt down terrorists who threaten our country wherever they are. That means I will not hesitate to take action against ISIL in Syria as well as Iraq. This is a core principle of my presidency. If you threaten America, you will find no safe haven.
Okay, now, right from the start, red warning sign should be flashing in your brain. Because right there, he started to say things that are very troubling. Airstrikes, okay, the American people understands that. Airstrikes. We are seeing that in some cases they can be extremely effective. But in order to conduct successful airstrikes, you do need American forces on the ground. And you need help on the ground. So what do we face here? I don't see how, in the long run, this president or a succeeding president is going to be able to go after these terrorists simply with airstrikes. This is mission creep, and it's going to have to be so. Just a couple of months ago, he started to say, we have to send advisors on the ground. We have to send intelligence on the ground. We have to send special forces on the ground because airstrikes require eyes on the ground. But what has he said here that is really, really disturbing is that not only are we going to conduct these airstrikes in Iraq, but we're going to have to go into Syria. So, not only are we returning to Iraq, but the president of peace is opening up another front in the war, another country. We're going to be going into another country, reluctantly going into a country. Remember, he didn't want to do anything in Syria for the longest time. Mitt Romney, John McCain, they've been saying for years, you got to get proactive about this civil war in Syria. Because if you don't, sooner or later, there's going to be a spillover effect into Iraq. And his whole team warned him about the possible spillover effect. But he kept saying he simply didn't want to do anything. And when he finally did stir to action, his plan was he was going to bomb Assad for the so-called use of chemical weapons. And then he changed his mind. That was a year ago. And then nothing happened. So when the public hears that he wants to go into Syria, after so many twists and turns in the Syria policy, of course, all of the bells are ringing. All of the red flags are waving. You're opening up another front in this war when you haven't concluded the Iraqi front properly. You blew that one. And you're now going to open up another front. And you're still trying to tell us that you're going to be able to do this predominantly with airstrikes. It simply doesn't make any sense. And that takes us to point number 2 of his strategy.
Second, we will increase our support for forces fighting these terrorists on the ground. In June, I deployed several hundred American service members to Iraq to assess how we can best support Iraqi security forces. Now that those teams have completed their work and Iraq has formed a government, we will send an additional 475 service members to Iraq. As I've said before, these American forces will not have a combat mission. We will not get dragged into another ground war in Iraq, but they are needed to support Iraqi and Kurdish forces with training, intelligence, and equipment. We'll also support Iraq's efforts to stand up National Guard units to help Sunni communities secure their own freedom from ISIL's control.
Part 2 of the strategy. Well, think about this one. He says that what we're actually going to do is we're going to use, ultimately, Iraqi troops to do the job for us. But what have we just seen? We saw ISIS roll right over Iraqi troops. It was the very Iraqi troops that he left behind, saying that they would be good enough to withstand any pressure. They're the ones that just collapsed. They're the ones that so many of them have been taken prisoners and beheaded. They're the ones who dropped their weapons. They're the ones who fled. They're the ones who are so divided along religious lines that they haven't been able to form a government. In other words, what forces on the ground are you talking about? What forces on the ground? And when we talk about the Iraqi security forces, are we not talking about the very same ones that George Bush and Dick Cheney have been trying to train for years? Now, let me tell you this. I was the editor of Base News while this was going on. I was in constant communication with members of our armed forces in Iraq who were training these troops. They were writing for me on the pages of the Washington Times. I was corresponding with them. I was asking them questions. And one thing they kept telling me again and again and again, you don't know how hard it is to train forces that are not used to these kinds of operations to do their job. In other words, they kept telling me this is going to take time. This is going to take a lot of time. I don't know if the American people fully grasps how long this is going to take. The troops on the ground knew that they had to basically stand side by side with Iraqi forces for years to come before they could fully say, you are strong enough to fight. It was a mission that was going to take years. We were in the midst of building up these forces. Then we pulled out. And now you think with just 1,000 of us, 1,000 Americans on the ground, the Iraqi forces, Shazam! They're going to be our partners on the ground. It's a bunch of nonsense. There are no viable partners on the ground right now. And what does that mean? It means, again, just like he told you when he was trying to pass Obamacare, that you can keep your health plan and you can keep your doctor, and then we found out you couldn't. The same lies are being told right now about what we're going to be doing there. We will have to send boys on the ground there. We are already doing so. Listen to how he tries to emphasize again and again what is obviously false.
Now, it will take time to eradicate a cancer like ISIL. And any time we take military action, there are risks involved, especially to the servicemen and women who carry out these missions. But I want the American people to understand how this effort will be different from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It will not involve American combat troops fighting on foreign soil. This counterterrorism campaign will be waged through a steady, relentless effort to take out ISIL wherever they exist using our air power and our support for partners' forces on the ground. This strategy of taking out terrorists who threaten us while supporting partners on the front lines is one that we have successfully pursued in Yemen and Somalia for years, and it is consistent with the approach I outlined earlier this year, to use force against anyone who threatens America's core interests, but to mobilize partners wherever possible to address broader challenges to international order.
Well, look, in a nutshell, that's exactly what Bush was trying to do. He was trying to build up those partners where clearly they didn't exist. That's why America ended up remaining in Iraq far longer than any of us wanted it to be so. And right now, what is happening is that the public is awakening to the enormity of the crisis that we are dealing with. And what's interesting is not only is the public saying we have to be vigilant on this war on terror, but now 34% of the American people recognize, once again, we are going to have to commit troops on the ground. He is lying to you when he is telling you that that's not happening now and that it won't happen in the future. You are listening to Dr. Grace, the editor of Politics and Culture at worldtribune.com, speaking the truth and always upholding values that are never ever going to die.
That's just how I feel. That's just how I feel. That's just how I feel.
This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
I think liberals are in denial. More denial. How many of them are missing George W. Bush? As Obama is experiencing a metamorphosis into Bush light, I think many voters are missing George Bush, the real thing, the one who was doing his homework, the one who knew what he was talking about, the one who was leading the public, the one who was saying we have no choice but to do this, the one who was in constant communication with people on the ground, the one who was in constant communication with his entire military top brass and his national security team. The one who told us in 2007 what would happen if we withdrew from Iraq prematurely. Roll it, Brittany.
I know some in Washington would like us to start leaving Iraq now. To begin withdrawing before our commanders tell us we are ready would be dangerous. For Iraq, for the region, and for the United States. It would mean surrendering the future of Iraq to al-Qaeda. It would mean that we'd be risking mass killings on a horrific scale. It would mean we allow the terrorists to establish a safe haven in Iraq to replace the one they lost in Afghanistan. It would mean increasing the probability that American troops would have to return at some later date to confront an enemy that is even more dangerous.
Wow, and prophetic. Every single thing he said was going to happen if we withdrew prematurely has happened right before our eyes. It would be dangerous for the Iraq and for us if we withdrew, he said. We would be risking mass killings on a horrific scale, which is what we have just seen. We would run the risk of the establishment of a safe haven to replace the one lost in Afghanistan. You're seeing ISIS with a caliphate right now doing that very thing. And we would risk having to return, which we are doing right now in a weakened position with a weak president who really doesn't want to go back in. The prophet George Bush. He told us what would happen. And how did he know? How did he know what would happen? In 2007, 7 years ago, he knew. Is it because he's so brilliant? Is it because he has an IQ higher than the rest of us? No. It's because he was in constant communication with everybody on the ground, and he had one virtue that this president doesn't have. He understands that people that have been doing a particular craft for years know what they're doing, and you should respect their opinion. You see, President Obama always thinks that he knows more and better than anybody else. Even the commanders, the military folks who do this for a living, who devote their whole lives to the study and conduct of war. No, he knows better. But the virtue that George Bush had was he was willing to delegate. Delegate to people who obviously know more than he did about what they were doing. It's their job. It's because he was just a little bit more humble than President Obama. And he could say, well, tell me, sir, based on your years of experience and expertise, what will happen if we withdraw? And when they gave him a response, he gave credence to their response. But what did our president do? He might ask the same question, but if he didn't like the answer, he just ignored it. And that's why now liberals and Democrats across this country look like they have been punched in the face. They look like they just caught their lover sleeping with somebody else. They can't believe it. They're white. They're ashen. They're disillusioned. They're shocked. They're having to reconsider everything that they thought was real. What is real? What is my reality? If any of you have ever experienced any kind of disillusionment, it consists of being absolutely convinced that something is true and then coming to the shocking realization that it isn't. And when that happens, it's shattering. Because for a couple of moments, you don't know how much of what you thought was reality is untrue. How far does it go? When did the lie begin? When did I start being wrong? And Democrats and liberals across this country are going through a profound disillusionment right now. And it's obvious on practically everybody's face. From Rachel Maddow to Chris Matthews to folks on ABC News this week with George Stephanopoulos, you see these analysts looking shocked, dumbfounded. The New York Times, and we go on and on and on. Oh, they're not going to apologize. They're not going to apologize for how badly they have led this country. But they are going through a profound disillusionment. Listen to one of the biggest champions of the Obama administration, Chris Matthews, in how he reacted to the speech this week.
Yeah, I heard all the necessary conditions, but not the sufficient conditions for defeating ISIS. And I didn't hear in there how we're going to encourage the Arab countries, the Islamic world, to go after ISIS. I didn't hear that. I heard airstrikes by the United States. I heard military training and support for the Free Syrian Army. I heard vague reference to someone over there flying with us over Syria right now without saying what country that was, what ally that was. Nothing really about the building of a posse. And everyone from Richard Ignatius, David Ignatius and others who really know this region are saying the only way you defeat a cancer like this, like ISIS, is within the Islamic world itself. They must find themselves the strength and the determination to go in and erase this blot on their culture. And I didn't hear in this speech how we're going to do that, or if we can't even imagine being the leaders of such an effort. As again, I'll say these are necessary steps. They didn't sound sufficient.
Didn't sound sufficient. Translation, the guy doesn't know what he's doing. And I see that now. That's basically what Chris Matthews said on the air. At one point, In analysis, Rachel Maddow actually said some of this is stomach churning. So you see, their reality, their perception of reality is cracking. The mirror is cracking. It's going to take them a bit of time to process this. But they're smart enough to ask good questions. The president now wants to be different than George Bush. So this campaign is going to include partners. What partners? Remember, they derided George Bush. He had a coalition of dozens of countries called the Coalition of the Willing. And they said that was just a mask. America was still behaving unilaterally. Well, guess what? So far, Obama is behaving even more unilaterally than George Bush because the coalition is smaller and we don't even know what the coalition is going to do. Arab partners, we're waiting. We're waiting. Arming the Free Syrian Army, the very folks that Obama told us consisted of a bunch of dentists and pharmacists and doctors that we couldn't possibly arm? So Chris Matthews is scratching his head. One moment the president tells us we can't arm these folks. We have no viable partners. The other moment he's telling us, yeah, we can do it. His head's been spinning in every direction. And the liberals keep saying, well, wait a minute, haven't we been told that the Islamic world should all be doing this themselves? That was our big critique against George Bush. Why are we intervening there? Why don't we let them do it themselves? And here Chris Matthews is saying, well, I don't see how Obama is showing us how they're going to do it themselves. How are the Iraqi going to do it themselves? How is anything going to change? Newsflash. They can't do it themselves. That's why we're there. That's why our allies on the ground, those who did support American intervention, saw us as liberators, as bringing something new to the Arab world. They can't do that. They cannot do it themselves. If they could, they would have. The minute we left, everything collapsed. So Chris Matthews is clearly saying the president isn't making sense. And what about correspondents who are working for the airhead media? They're on the ground. They see the truth. Folks like Richard Engel. Listen to his reaction to the president's speech.
Well, I think I know there are already American boots on the ground where I am now. They are not necessarily firing their rifles or kicking down doors, and we're not going on embeds with these troops. They are troops who are staying away from reporters. They are embedded with local fighters, trying to guide in airstrikes, gathering intelligence, the kind of things that you would have thought the Green Berets would have done many years ago, and which now are being done by Navy SEALs and Delta Force and other special operations forces. Can you conduct a secret war like this, a war by remote control to dislodge ISIS, to dislodge this terrorist group, this militant murderous group from large parts of Iraq and large parts of Syria? We will see. It is an open question. I think the biggest problem with this strategy is that the first part is very clear. He wants to carry out airstrikes to kill enemies who harm the United States. That seems very similar to the kinds of things that the United States is already doing in Somalia, in Yemen. The rest of the strategy seemed incredibly fuzzy, how that there was going to be this international coalition that would lend its moral support of Sunni countries, that you would have to rebuild the Iraqi army, which has lost a tremendous amount of credibility so far, and that you would work with all of these local partners on the ground. There are some local partners where I am. I'm in northern Iraq, in Kurdistan, and there are some local partners here, and we've been out with those Kurdish fighters who work very closely and very well with the Americans. But in Syria, there aren't any local partners. There are fictitious partners that he's talking about. In Iraq, below where I am right now, there is the Iraqi army, which is disintegrated and is not an effective partner right now. So aside from the very specific idea of sending in special operators, carrying out some drones, the rest of the strategy seems still quite unclear.
Unclear, fuzzy, confused. Translation, he doesn't know what he's doing. Basically, you now have the left-wing media concluding that this president is taking us again down the road of war without a clear plan for victory, without a clear definition of the mission, without a clear exit strategy. This is not only the not Bush, it's the worse than Bush presidency. That's what's dawning on them. And now the blame game starts. How much blame do the Democrats and the liberals and this president get for the current mess that we are in, which is a bigger mess than what we faced after 9/11? Listen to Jay Carney and John McCain hashing it out.
Well, I think it was a very weak argument. By the way, I'm astounded that Mr. Carney should say that the Free Syrian Army is now stronger. In fact, they've been badly,
well, that's not what I said,
damaged.
Senator. I said, if I could, sir, what I said is that we know a great deal more about the makeup of the opposition.
Come on, Jay, we knew all about them then. You just didn't choose to know. I was there in Syria. We knew them. Come on, you guys are the ones. It's your boss is the one that when the entire national security team wanted to arm and train them, that he turned them down, Mr. Carney, after a.
Well, Senator,
I'm not.
So I think we have to agree to disagree on this.
No, facts are stubborn things, Mr. Carney, and that is his entire national security team, including his Secretary of State, said we want to arm and train and equip these people, and he made the unilateral decision to turn them down.
Facts are stubborn things, and what the events of the last couple of months has shown us is that George Bush was right all along, and this president, the liberals and the Democrats, got it all wrong. It's time to pick up the phone and call him for his advice. Ask him for apology and ask him what the best way forward is. You're listening to Dr. Grace, upholding values that never die.
The stories that matter, the issues that count. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace. The stories that matter, the issues that count. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
We're caught in a trap. I can't walk out because I love you too much, baby.
Suspicious minds. Now, everything the president has said is going to be called into question. Everything the liberals have been telling us is going to be called into question. Remember, they have been telling us that essentially we weren't giving enough credence to so-called freedom fighters who had legitimate grievances. Even in the speech last night, what did the president say? He wanted to emphasize that ISIL is not, quote unquote, Islamic, that no religion condones the killing of innocents. So, one thing that this president is still holding on to is that we're not at war with Islamic radicalism. He doesn't really want to go there. And where does Islamic radicalism come from? And what part of the Muslim faith fuels that? Liberals have been telling us we can't go there mentally, psychologically. We can't go there in print. We can't go there in speech. That would be tarnishing too many people with one brush. All religions require respect, of course, except Christianity, of course, because the liberals are the first to defile the Christian faith. But defending the Muslim faith, that's one of their sacred cows. And in the speech last night, one of the things that the president said is one aspect of his 4-part plan is to, quote unquote, counter the warped ideology of ISIS. But did you notice that he never explained the nature of the ideology? He didn't want to get into it because one of the first things that he did upon coming to office was he scrubbed official government documents of references to an ideology that we were at war with. That was Bush's mistake. Because what Bush had not properly understood, according to the Obama and his followers, is that if we recognize the legitimate grievances of the Muslim people and stopped assaulting their worldview and showing them more respect and apologizing for our wrongs, that we would be able to achieve reconciliation and peace. And now we know that everything Obama said is wrong, and now liberals have to ask the next set of questions. Are we at war with an ideology? To what extent does this ideology come from the Muslim faith? To what extent does Islam fuel this? With whom exactly are we at war? Now, let me tell you this. There's one person in the media that I despise. I generally don't use that word. I generally don't despise people. But there is one person that I truly do, and one of the reasons that he strikes a deep chord is because he is the biggest critic, the biggest defiler of the Christian faith out there. In my view, the way this man for years has attacked Christianity is purely satanic, and every fiber in my being recoils against him. But guess what? Bill Maher is seeing the light to some extent. The next sequence of clips that I'm going to show you, I think many of you are going to be absolutely dumbfounded. This is a debate between Bill Maher and Charlie Rose. And he goes places and says things that liberals have not dared to go. Places liberals have not dared to go. Said things liberals have not dared to say about the Muslim faith itself. Roll it, Brittany.
I saw Howard Dean on TV the other day, and he said something along the order of, he said, the people in ISIS are, I said, I'm about as Islamic as they are. You know, distancing the vast numbers of Islamic people around the world from it. That's just not true.
It is true.
It is not true, Charlie. There is a connecting tissue between...
you mean, you know, behind every Muslim is a future member of some radical...
Let me finish.
I thought I was doing that.
There are illiberal beliefs that are held by vast numbers of Muslim people that I don't think...
Vast number of Christians, too.
No, that's not true. Not true. Vast numbers of Christians do not believe that if you leave the Christian religion, you should be killed for it. Vast numbers of Christians do not treat women as second-class citizens. Vast numbers of Christians
I agree with that.
Do not believe that if you draw a picture of Jesus Christ, you should get killed for it.
So Bill Maher standing up to Charlie Rose on what point? On the point that Christians are not as violent as Muslims. And not just the extremists, but according to their core convictions. Wow. Are you still sitting on your chair? Did you ever think you'd see the day where a liberal, anti-Christian bigot like Bill Maher sees the light on a point that is extremely obvious to the rest of the world? That Christianity is a religion of peace, and yet there are elements within the Muslim faith that condone violence. And not just the extreme versions of the faith, but some of the core tenets of the faith. And Bill Maher goes on to rip Charlie Rose apart, piece by piece.
So yes, does ISIS do Khmer Rouge-like activities where they just kill people indiscriminately who aren't just like them? Yes. And would most Muslim people in the world do that or condone that? No. But most Muslim people in the world do condone violence just for what you think. They do. First of all, they say it. They shout it from the...
Vast majorities of Muslims
Absolutely.
say that?
There's a Pew poll of Egypt done a few years ago. 82%, I think it was, said stoning is the appropriate punishment for adultery. Over 80% thought death was the appropriate punishment for leaving the Muslim religion. I'm sure you know these things.
I know. Well, I do.
But I don't that this religion is like other religions is just naive and plain wrong. It is not like other religions. The New York Times pointed out in an op-ed a couple of weeks ago that in Saudi Arabia, just since August 4th, I think it was, they have beheaded 19 people. Most for non-violent crimes, including homosexuality.
Those didn't got the hands off the thief.
Right. Okay. So we're upset that ISIS is beheading people, which we should be upset about. But Saudi Arabia does it, and they're our good friends because they have oil.
Right.
Okay? But they do it too. This is the center of the religion.
So Bill Maher speaking the obvious. The Muslim faith is not like other religions, contrary to what this president said in his speech. He said we have to counter its warped ideology, but didn't go beyond that. What does he mean by that? Well, in this exchange that you just heard between Bill Maher and Charlie Rose, Bill Maher is saying beheading goes on in Muslim countries as a matter of their legal code. Muslim countries that we partner with. Violent acts, like Charlie Rose chimed in, the cutting off of the hands of thieves goes on in Muslim countries as a matter of their legal code condoned by their religion. So what's clear is the Muslim faith at its very core permits a level of violence that no other religious faith does. And now the key question is this. And in this point, Bush tried to hammer it home to the American people, and Obama will try to do the same thing. There's this idea that the moderate Muslims are the ones that we need to partner with, and that the moderate Muslims are the ones that are going to lead us into the future. Bill Maher asks the question, who and where are these moderate Muslims? Roll it.
But, I mean, in Mecca, where infidels, non-Muslims, are not even allowed in the holy parts of the city. I mean, right there, we don't have that example in other religions. Okay, they do behead people. Now, if they were beheading people in Vatican City, which is the equivalent of Mecca in... Don't you think there'd be a bigger outcry about it? So this is the soft bigotry of low expectations that we have with Muslim people.
Yeah.
When they do crazy things and believe crazy things, somehow it's just not talked about nearly as much.
Would you come to this table and have a debate about this with a moderate Muslim?
Find one, yes. Find one.
I promise you I'll find one.
Find a Muslim.
I do believe that what we see with ISIS is not representative of...
As I said, connecting tissue.
It's not representative of the Islamic religion.
Again,
I don't think the Quran teaches them to do this kind of
Well, you're wrong about that. The Quran absolutely has on every page stuff that's horrible about how the infidel should be treated. But, for example, again, ISIS says that they should perform genital mutilation on all women 11 to 46. Right. Would most Muslims agree with that? No. Or carry it out? No. But as Ayaan Hirsi Ali points out, she says, can we really say, well, and she would know better than either one of us. She said, can we really say that women are treated equally in the Muslim world? I mean, their testimony in court is very often counted as half. They need permission to leave the house in some places.
But a lot of moderate Muslims would say, in fact, one of the things that we need to modernize is the idea of the way we treat women. Lots of them. But in this country, if you just use the wrong word about women, they go nuts. And in all these other countries, they're doing things like making them wear burqas, and I hear liberals say things like, well, they want to. They want to. They've been brainwashed. You know, they don't want. It's like saying a streetwalker wants to do that.
There is so much in that segment. Look, on this show, I have said before, and I cited a couple of groups that there was a report in the Wall Street Journal about a couple of groups, Islamic groups, that really wanted to stand up against the violent elements in their faith and in their communities. So certainly I'm not here suggesting that all Muslims are violent or that every aspect of Islam is violent. But what I am saying, and what Bill Maher is saying, is that there's got to be an honest discussion amongst the non-Muslims and the Muslims about what part of their faith is fueling these radical offshoots that are committing such barbaric acts. And it's true, these barbaric acts are being committed against Muslims. And as you heard, in many cases, they're being committed against Muslim women. Some extreme elements like genital mutilation is denounced by other factions of Islam. Yet, we do need to have a frank, honest discussion when we talk about the ideology that's driving ISIS. How much of this is linked to an Islamic faith that condones elements of violence? And I think one of the most helpful phrases that came out of that interaction between Bill Maher and Charlie Rose is Bill Maher saying, there is a soft bigotry of low expectations when we discuss Muslims. I am glad that finally Bill Maher is standing up for the Christian faith in contrast to the Muslim faith and seeing its merits, its virtues. I am glad that a liberal like Bill Maher and a liberal like Charlie Rose are finally asking the tough question, what elements of the Islamic faith are connected to, the connecting tissue to all of the violence erupting across the world that we are seeing today. And I think that if we're truly going to eradicate the scourge of terrorism from the face of the earth, we're not going to be able to do it until that discussion is had thoroughly amongst Muslims and amongst the rest of us. You're listening to Dr. Grace, upholding values that are never going to die.
This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
Welcome to American Heartland with Dr. Grace. This week also marks the 13th anniversary of a horrific day on American soil when we were struck by terrorists in New York, in Washington, and a plane went down in Pennsylvania, a plane en route to the Capitol. And we lost 3,000 innocent civilians. 13 years ago. The question we are facing this week, are we safer than we were then? And the president tried to tell us in his speech that we are safer. Again, a naked, brazen, unabashed lie. We are not safer. In fact, we are under greater threat than ever before. This war on terror that began in a very self-conscious way after we were struck on 9/11 is a war that has encompassed a wide variety of people. Many have been involved in fighting it. And I think as we reflect on that terrible tragedy, we have to reflect too on the ensuing tragedies in so many people's lives. All of our service members, the men and women who have served on our behalf, trying to bring these terrorists to heel, the thousands of lives that have been lost, and the thousands more men and women who have come back maimed, wounded, their lives shattered in some cases, the hundreds who have come back in such despair and such agony that they have taken their lives, the pain and pressure on the family members, the incredible stress on military wives who deal with deployment, and then, even when their husbands come home, they deal with the trauma, the psychological trauma, the physical trauma, the wounds of war that go on for decades and decades and ricochet into their families. We have been dealing with this since 9/11. And I think what pains me the most is that we know, those of us who follow the news, what is going on. We know there is a war on terror. We know this is going to be a long war. But yet, you have a large segment of the country that is not contributing to this war. They're not contributing any of their talents, any of their skills, any of their know-how. A large segment of this country is oblivious, not just to the pain and suffering that occurred on that day, but to the ongoing pain and suffering and sacrifice. To the ongoing sacrifice since that day and going forward into the future. Because as the president made clear in his speech, this isn't going to end in 6 months or a year or 2 years. Essentially, the next president is going to have to take on this mantle. And I think that it is necessary for all of us who lead public opinion and all of us who follow the news to enlist as many as we can in this war against terror. Because this war is a vast war, and it's not going to be won simply if we allow one minority of the population to do all of the heavy lifting while we basically sit on our rear ends watching television. That's not the patriotic way. That's not the way to move forward as a nation. I think we also need our political leaders to call upon all of us to help in this war on terror. If we are at war against a mortal enemy, and if we send our men and women in the field of battle to die or to return home wounded, then we, all of us, have to do our part to win this war. We have no right simply to put this enormous burden on so few. And I hope that in the ensuing months and years, we will have more public opinion leaders and political leaders calling for every member of our nation to do their part, however small it is. If it's as small as helping a wounded warrior, helping a wife suffering, helping somebody to heal from the grief of loss. Anything and everything should be done. If we are truly at war, then we should all be at war. On this 13th year anniversary, we have to stand, not just with those who lost lives, but with all those who continue to fight so we can have a free, prosperous, civilized world in which the word terror is expunged from our lives. This is a job, a responsibility that we all have to uphold. You're listening to Dr. Grace, upholding values that never die.
Here's what I tell everyone. I was born by God's dear grace.
The stories that matter, the issues that count. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.